Ethiopian troops became embedded around Bedoya. As I said earlier, Prime Minister Yusuf had close ties with the Ethiopians, and so he was able to curry their favor and call upon their support to entrench themselves. This happened in about June of 2006. Well, as the year went on, and that was around the same time that the, like I said, the ICU wound up consolidating their power in Mogadishu and wound up expanding. The rest of the year, they continued to expand. There are various skirmishes between Ethiopian troops and the Islamist forces. And on December 20th and 21st of 2006 is when it really starts to go down. On Christmas Eve, Ethiopian troops blatantly invade and engage. They attack the airport. They are accused of attacking hospitals by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc. They're accused of attacking hospitals blatantly and stealing and looting medical supplies, engaging in retributive punishment for, when an attack came from someplace, they would just go after it. This is before the occupation, mind you. There's more dastardly deeds committed later on during the occupation. Incidentally, the Ethiopian invasion followed a UN resolution passed by the Security Council, UN resolutions 1724 and 1725, I want to say, which blatantly state that Somalia needed to be respected and its territorial integrity needed to be respected by its neighbors. And it called on an African Union peacekeeping force, AMISOM as it would be called, to come in. And that force could not include troops from the neighboring states, Djibouti, Eritrea, and Ethiopia because of the historic rivalries between all the nations. In all honesty, in real life, if you were talking with a straight face, you would say the last thing we would want is a Somalia that's just the pawn of a nation around it. However, John Abazad visited Ethiopia around the same time. He's the CENTCOM commander, the commander of all the forces in the central world, of U.S. Forces in central part of the world, Central Asia, Central America, Africa, the current, and I think it includes Europe too. Don't quote me on that, but I think it does. But they're forming a new African command, to replace this. But at the time, he's still very important. He visits a couple around the same time that this resolution is passed. Coincidentally, right before Ethiopia invades, blatantly in violation of the resolution. They do so with with what at the time was seen as tacit U.S. support, but the New York Times would report in January, about a month after the invasion, that American special forces had been deployed as well and had been on the ground with Ethiopian troops and participated in the invasion. It went on to report that various mercenary groups had been in the country for months in support of the Ethiopian troops and the transitional federal government in Bedoya, in violation of a UN arms embargo, and they supposedly met with the CIA and Ethiopia. American, Ethiopian, and Kenyan military planners all worked together. All their intelligence services shared intelligence, and the Ethiopia could count upon U.S. radar and the use of U.S. ships for the radar purposes to help facilitate the invasion. It's blatantly illegal, no matter how it's seen. It's in violation of not just the usual UN resolutions, Security Council resolutions, but also one that was purportedly passed specifically to help restore order in Somalia. The Islamists fought back, but were no match for the Ethiopian army because Ethiopia, incidentally, gets more military aid than any other country in sub-Saharan Africa. And so they were able to utilize fairly, modern technological military equipment to completely outclass a bunch of teenagers with AK-47s. And from there, we get into the occupation. Well, ostensibly, one of the reasons you do this, and this is what the Ethiopians, the Americans all said, was that, this was to defend the borders and to stop the spread of militaristic Islam. It would be called Islamofascism by David Horowitz and his cats. But it was primarily it's done supposedly to help Somalia to get rid of those infringements upon freedom that the Islamic Courts Union had been imposing upon people. But like the first thing the transitional federal government did was impose martial law. I mean, almost the very first edict and act on their part. It was almost, and what's the first thing they do? They suppress freedom of movement. They suppress media, political and cultural expression. They the typical things that happen when martial law is declared. Well, what happens when you overthrow a somewhat popular, regime? You replace it with one that, like I said, had always been seen as, irrelevant and a pawn of foreign powers and not a player, and nobody cared. Well, obviously an insurgency started up because it was Ethiopia, which is approximately half Christian, a majority Muslim, according to some sources, majority Christian according to others, but never more than like 52-49, 53-47, either way, you know what I'm saying, was seen as invading a predominantly Muslim nation, because at the very least Ethiopia is Christian-led. So what did that call? The familiar calls for jihad from the Al-Qaeda folks and that crazy line of the Islamist thinking, which does not represent Islam across the board. But those people had another reason to show up, so they started showing up. Ethiopia, incidentally, one of the first things they did during the attack was blow up the Mogadishu International Airport, civilian airport, not a military establishment. They said it was because illegal fighters were coming in, which presumably they meant that Al-Qaeda guys were flying in on civilian flights, and so they had to take care of it. But one way or another, civilian airport's not a military target, in my opinion. But Ethiopia, during their occupation, would work with transitional federal government troops and engage in all kinds of human rights violations, according to Human Rights Watch, the European Union, and Amnesty International. According to Amnesty International, Kenya got into it a little bit too, when the refugee crisis exacerbates by closing its borders and arbitrarily detaining and imprisoning refugees without charges and without excuse me. And 27 of them, as of I want to say July of 2007, were still in prison and had nobody knew. They hadn't been charged. They were still in jail in Kenya. But yeah, Kenya was getting into that, and also various human rights. But I'll get to the refugee crisis in a second. But the Ethiopians started dealing with an insurgency. The TFG did too, because like I said, they're unpopular. Nobody wanted them around. Their response to the insurgency was to just, if somebody fired a mortar or rockets from a neighborhood or from a block and they can tell, they would just turn their guns and mortars and rockets on that neighborhood and just start shooting. According to Human Rights Watch and according to the EU, like I said, just start shooting randomly. According to Black Commentator, an online newspaper, really good, they would round up people in trucks, just go into neighborhoods and round up people by the truckloads and arbitrarily detain them. They shut down radio stations constantly. One radio station, Radio Shabelle, was shut down 3 different times, because they're trying to stifle, any kind of dissent, any kind of cultural expression, anything that went against what the TFG, the Transitional Federal Government of Somalia, along with their Ethiopian backers, were trying to implement.